Hey guys, welcome to the seventh discussion. We're going to be covering the chapters 6, 7, 8, and 9, and we have 3 questions regarding those, and we'll be wrapping up ethics in a nutshell. So, the first question, using the techniques articulated in chapter 7, analyze the argument and the analogy. So, the analogy was we require people to perform tests to acquire a license to drive, because people could possibly harm others and themselves. So why don't we do the same thing for having children? So the first thing I would like to do is kind of examine the similarities between the two analogies or both arguments. So in each circumstance, there is the possibility of endangering others. That's the primary factor that relates the two. So next, I would kind of like to step back a little bit and look at the differences between the two arguments. So the biggest difference would be we're talking about a child in one and then a vehicle in the other, because that's one of the biggest differences in the two arguments. It's going to be significant to look at that. So a baby is not a full person capable of logic or reasoning, but eventually they'll be able to do that. Whereas a car is an inanimate object, and it's never going to be able to do that unless this is like Knight Rider or something. But I think with the two differences there, we're going to have to kind of reevaluate these differences, and we should approach both arguments with different moral logics. So the second question, drawing on chapter 6, briefly articulate all things considered view. The first is Kantianism. So Kantianism would argue we must treat all people with respect because they are capable of logical reasoning. Because a car is merely a tool, we would need to reorganize our arguments or analogies. Or I guess according to Kantianism, we would need to kind of disregard that analogy. Second would be utilitarianism. So utilitarianism would need to determine if parenting license would maximize overall net pleasure and minimize net pain. So one could argue the parents unable to obtain a license and the orphan children would feel a lot of pain, but overall it would lead to a more pleasurable outcome. Therefore, the analogy could be valid in utilitarianism views, but that just depends on how you measure net pain and net pleasure. So, feminist care ethics would argue that one should prioritize the interest of loved ones over everything else. So, it would be unethical to separate a parent from a child. And then last but not least, virtue ethics states that we should acknowledge our virtues and avoid our acknowledged vices. This ethics focuses on the individual rather than the group. So I believe virtue ethics would require an individual to develop themselves rather than enforcing others to do so. So I think the analogy would be kind of incompatible with virtue ethics. Lastly, applying chapter 8 tests your view of coherence with your views on related issues, as well as with consistency with any relevant moral intuitions you may have. So initially, I believed it was unethical to require individuals to have license to have children, but I decided I need to do some moral reflecting so I could, find out why I feel this way and if this thought is valid. So I started examining what I did agree with in the two analogies, or necessarily the second analogy. And the first thing I recognized was that in certain circumstances, children should be removed from their parents. But that being said, I believe if a person can prove themselves worthy, they should be allowed to regain custody, because that would probably be best for the child and the parent, and probably society as a whole. So in this sense, maybe a license could be effective. But after I really thought about that for a while, I came to the conclusion that a license is not necessarily needed to perform these actions, because we already have a form of this, Child Protective Services, and I know it can be, very flawed, but I believe if anything, we should develop our society and we should be more proactive rather than reactive, especially whenever it comes to basic human rights such as having children.